Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I am your host, Alec Lewis. This is episode 157, recording on Tuesday, April 14th. Going to give you guys some draft thoughts, some intel, and then I took some mock drafts from fans for a story at The Athletic on Tuesday. And there was one mock draft that did catch my eye that I didn't write about. So I'm going to get into that kind of towards the end of the show. I will give you the username of the person who sent it and why it intrigued me very much later on. But yeah, thought that would be a fun way to round out this show. If you're new here and watching on YouTube, first of all, thanks for being here. We do this 2 times a week, every week. It's Vikings talk all the time. I cover the team for The Athletic. I'm in the building throughout the weeks, talk to a lot of people around the team, and absolutely love the job and love communicating directly with you guys. So started this show a couple years ago, and we have a ton of fun with it. Hit the subscribe button on YouTube. Pretty easy to get notifications for all future episodes. And then if you're listening on Apple or Spotify or iHeart, you can follow us at those spots. You can like at those spots. You can rate us with stars over on those spots. And I think that helps us out. I don't really know, but I'd like to think it could. So we would appreciate that a ton. Before we get into the intel, this show is presented by First Resource Bank. Somehow, if you don't know about it, either you haven't been listening or you haven't been paying attention. I mean, these guys, it's a member FDIC bank run by Tim Siegley, Aaron Siegley, Charlie Anderson. Like I said, they care about the Vikings community. Like I've said in the past, they have structured and developed an online banking platform that has been my go-to since I moved up here a few years ago to cover this team. And yeah, they've got questions just like you guys do about the draft and have been awesome to work with over time. So we thank them for their presenting sponsorship. And then the show is also happy to support Pro MN Athletics. This company was started a year ago, and in the last year, they've had like 500 kids participate in camps, youth football camps throughout the state. Really, it was started by a couple guys, Graham and Kurt, who wanted to lift the tide of development at the youth level in football here in Minnesota, and they've worked with some awesome coaches like Tanner Morgan, who played quarterback in Minnesota, like some other former Gophers, John Mann and Eric Carter, but they've got 7-on-7 leagues. They've got more intense development in terms of winter academy and spring academies. But if your son plays football, if you got friends whose kids play football and they want to improve and understand some of the process of kind of the developmental arc, I highly recommend you guys checking out Pro MN Athletics, and their information and link is in the description below. All right, let's get right to the draft thoughts and intel and perspective that I think is worthwhile, as we are like 10 days and under now until the draft begins, and I can't wait. The first thing I'd start, so the Vikings have finalized a lot of their visits, especially in person. So last week, kind of towards the end of last week, there were a lot of prospects who flew into Minnesota, spent time in Eagan, and those visits range in terms of their influence and impact and kind of value, I would say. So some, for the Vikings, it's a very specific medical process where there are guys that need to go through a rigorous medical check for the Vikings to really green flag or red flag whether or not they are fits for this team. For other guys, it's just conversations in the room. How would certain prospects be on the board? How would certain prospects be working with coaches? Just as communicators, what is their favorite learning style? Like, that is a opportunity, I would say, for the Vikings to ascertain some of that information. And then there's other opportunities for film sessions, like in the past, specifically in the last few years. Like, you've heard Kevin O'Connell sat down with Donovan Jackson. Kevin O'Connell sat down with Jordan Addison, and some of those sessions have influenced decision making over time, but they don't necessarily have to. I'd say some visits are more box checking, some are intel gathering, and they all hold some kind of value for the team, and it differs in terms of each specific prospect and why they are here or why they were here and what the value is within that. The Vikings have also had some Zoom invites and some of Zoom meetings, and some of that stuff can be um, to again similar information gathering, but some of it is also trying to acquire how the likelihood of whether a guy goes here, or if that player is an undrafted prospect, is that someone that the Vikings are going to be interested in targeting. So that stuff is done, and you got this week, which is really like the teams putting the finishing touches of their draft boards. I was talking to somebody who is in another NFC building, partaking in some of these draft sessions, and it sounds like it's a lot of long days. It's a lot of assessments of players with different views in the room, and the stuff can kind of drag. But these are, it's the time where these teams go through the process. What's been interesting for me, and I hinted on this at the top, but in asking for a lot of you guys, mock drafts and what you would prefer, there's themes among them, there's differences among them, and they've kind of given me somewhat of a perspective that, paired with information, I think is pretty interesting to talk through on this podcast. And it's really like the flexibility and the malleability that the Vikings are going to have depending on how things really play out at the very top. And what I mean by that is, let's say at number 18, the Vikings stick and pick and take a safety. Well, that will obviously influence the fact that at yes, they're going to take best available player, but you're probably not going to take another safety or DB type, safety player with flexibility at number 49. So let's say you take stick and pick with safety at number 18, then you're probably looking at receiver, running back, in the 49 range. Let's say, some of the safeties the Vikings were to like at number 18 are gone. You end up taking a guy like tight end Kenyon Sadiq at 18. Well, then you're probably not going to take it and follow that up with the receiver at 49. You could be looking at the defensive type of range. So there's, the dominoes of how all of that can play out are why mock drafts at this time are really, really, I think they're interesting, they're valuable, but they're also really difficult to peg because um, one slot changing can obviously dictate how the rest of the draft is going to flow, even though teams talk about wanting to take best available players. Like there are certain pockets of the draft where certain positions have the most talent. And so I'd say with this specific draft, round 2, like there's a lot of receivers in that range who are very interesting. When you're talking about Jeremy Bernard, Alabama, you're talking about Antonio Williams from Clemson, you're talking about Dazon Stribling from Ole Miss. Like there's a lot of receivers in that specific range who I would be eyeing if the Vikings were to go with the defensive player at the top. I think in round 3, that's where the running backs kind of fall, whether it's Mike Washington from Arkansas, whether it's Emmett Johnson from Nebraska, Jonah Coleman from Washington. And then there's a bunch of like DB prospects within that range too, whether it's Traden Stukes from Arizona, whether it's Jalen Kilgore from South Carolina. A lot of options that would provide some explosiveness, athleticism, and versatility for the Vikings kind of in that day 2, day 3 range. And that, in talking to everybody, whether that's people internally, whether that's, scouts and executives in other building, like the sweet spot of what is interesting from a lot of people within the league in this draft is from picks 30 to 70. And so fortunately, or I'd say, probably 30 to 100, but really 30 to 70. So the idea for the Vikings of potentially trading back um, and acquiring another pick in that range, a pick or two in that range, like that is, it's pretty interesting. You could even think about packaging, like what if you were to trade back 10 spots and, add a second round pick and then package 163 and move up to like 110 or something. Then you'd have essentially 5 to 6 picks within that range of guys who could become potential starters. That becomes quite interesting. But that's what that's kind of the flexibility within this draft that I find pretty interesting, and some of the players who I have had and will continue to have my eyes on kind of as this thing progresses. I will also say this, for as much as safety has been discussed, specifically with Dylan Thieneman at number 18, what's pretty unavoidable is there are a lot of late round safeties who are are interesting, whether it's guys who have ball skills, instincts, who have the makeup to become starters. Like I would say the Vikings took Jay Ward in the middle rounds a few years ago, but there, you see it every year of safeties who maybe don't light up the athleticism metrics, but they are instinctive and they do have ball skills, and they end up sticking around for a long time. And so I think there is a clump of guys in the 5th round, in the 6th round, potentially even in the 7th round, who would fit and who would have the smarts and the ability to come in and vie for meaningful playing time kind of at that spot. You'd obviously love dynamic ability on the back end. It's why a guy like Cam Curl, who I believe was extended by the Rams, like, it was a guy like this team really, really loved, but was never really going to be available to them in free agency. So, how they try to go about that spot, I think is, I think it's really interesting. The other one, there's a world in which, as is always the case with these drafts, where teams are on the phone with one another and subjects surface. And one of them, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point the topic is broached with some team with the Vikings about Jonathan Grenard. Now, would the asking price, I don't expect the Vikings asking price to dip beneath where they started. They have held a very strong line with this because they value Jonathan Grenard heavily, and they know he is integral to them being the best defense that they can be in 2026 and probably in the short-term future. And so, is there a team that misses out on an edge rusher that decides to pony up and go above and beyond with the 2nd-round pick or 1st-round pick or future 2nd-round pick that would entice the Vikings enough to where they could then pair that move with drafting an edge rusher? Like, I think that's it's something that as I enter that Thursday, Friday, Saturday, it's just going to be in the back of my mind. I said this a little bit earlier in this podcast, but this is a segue into that mock draft we're going to talk about. I just can't get the idea of trading back out of my mind, because I think once you get past like number 15, there is a clump of a lot of prospects who are really intriguing players who have a lot of different skill sets at a lot of different positions, whether it's safety, tackle, defensive line, like guys who fit a ton within that, 15 to 30 range, who are really considered like 1st, 2nd round type prospects, to where if you draft them at 28, that's probably their more realistic. I'm just throwing 28 out there, by the way. But if you're drafting at 28, that's more realistic value for those specific players. And then if you can recoup another premium pick in that day 2 range, then you could, start to pluck off some of the very important needs that you have, whether it's DB, receiver, center, off ball linebacker, even potentially in that range. So again, just can't get the idea of trading back out of my mind, and it's something that I'm going to have to do a lot of work on before I do my final mock next Monday to feel really good that to I guess to get to the point where I rule out that being the route that I go, is what I would say. Now, as we've talked about many times, and as we will continue to trade back is going to require a team to be willing to trade up. But I'd say with where the Vikings are, and with where other teams are, like you could have a team like we're going to talk about in a second with this mock draft that I'm going to dissect, like the Houston Texans, where they have shown a willingness to go after their players in recent drafts, which means trading up. And they are in more of a win now window. Not that the Vikings aren't, but to where they have all the chips in, considering where they are, to where it might be possible to make that move. Now, you'd have to be comfortable with a clump of players in making that move, but I don't, I wouldn't dismiss this as a possibility. And I really I think if it were to happen, I'd be probably a pretty solid fan of it. So, all right, let's get right into this specific mock draft that I want to dissect on today's show that was submitted by a fan who I will mention here in a second. All right, this mock draft was submitted on social media where you guys can follow the show at Alec Lewis Show, Instagram and Twitter. You can follow me at Alec_Lewis. But I put out a call for just fan perspective fan perspective mock drafts that I thought would be fun and interesting to kind of analyze. And there's a story at theathletic.com with me doing that. But this one came in later after I'd finished the writing and filed the story off to the editor. And it's from a username at Suits Bayer, at SUITSBAER. This was submitted through the Draft Hub, Pro Football Network. The draft was given a B- grade, but I just found it fascinating, and for a couple reasons, and we'll walk through it. But we'll start here. So this to lead off the conversation we just had. This was a trade back in the first round from 18 to 28 with the Houston Texans. And what did they get for that? Well, they got number 59. The Vikings also sent number 244 with that. So you move back 10 spots, you get a late second round pick. And that means, in this scenario, you would have 28, 49, 59, 82, and 97. So really 5 darts to throw in the meat of the draft where you would hope to probably emerge with 4 solid starters who are core players for your future. And for me, just like as I think about it, the idea of that with where this team and where this roster is and where they want to go would just be so, it would be awesome. It would be really probably beneficial for this team. And so the picks are as follows. At 28, Blake Miller. And I'll just go one by one and analyze them. So Blake Miller, for the uninitiated, this guy is probably one of the highest character guys in the draft. He was a right tackle at Clemson, really good athlete, barely missed practice and barely missed a game. Like if the Vikings were to want to move on from Brian O'Neill after this year, which I have not received any indication that would be the case. Like Brian O'Neill has been beloved internally from the coaching staff, from the front office, from teammates, everybody, and to where that I've said this, I believe that, or I know that the two sides talked about extension numbers at the combine, and we'll see how that plays out moving forward. But like literally a guy who would fit the Brian O'Neill type of mold for what a right tackle would be and should be is a Blake Miller from Clemson. And so I have just said, on this podcast and writing, the idea of ruling out a tackle in the first round is not something I'm willing to do. I just there's a lot of pretty intriguing players at that position, and knowing they want to go the best available route, it's one that I just can't cross off on the board, especially via a trade back. Now, would a Blake Miller get to 28? I don't know. Would that be the pick if a guy like Ohio State's Caden McDonald's available? Good question. What about if a guy like Dylan Thieneman is still available? Good question. But I think the idea of getting 59 is what makes this one worthwhile to me to talk about. At 49, the mock draft has Jadarian Price. Who is Jadarian Price? You guys might be asking. He was a running back at Notre Dame in the backfield with Jeremiah Love. He is widely regarded as the second best running back prospect in this class. Really good vision. Does he have the high-end explosive home run hitting ability? Probably not. But he's smooth. He sees it pretty quickly. He can catch. He was well coached in college. Every report that I've read and seen is that he is a really high character guy. I would probably think about him in like a Kyron Williams mold. And so if this is the final year of Aaron Jones being in Minnesota, replacing him with a guy like Jadarian Price would make a lot of sense. And similar to tackle at one, like running back in the day two range is not something that I'm going to rule out, whether it's Darian Price or Mike Washington or Jonah Coleman or Emmett Johnson. Like if those guys are available and the Vikings have already and they're the best possible player at those picks, that makes sense to me. At 59, um, Traden Stukes, the cornerback from Arizona. He is a nickel corner, really rangy type of athlete, plays the ball downfield extremely well. He can also play safety. And I know the Vikings have obviously done work on this player. I would be pretty surprised if he gets to 59 just based upon everything that I've heard. And probably would be more even at 49. I don't know if he gets to 49, but definitely think this would be a guy on their radar. Definitely think cornerback, whether it's nickel corner, DB, safety type, is going to be in play in that day two range if a player they like is available. So, yeah, I like that pick at 59. 82 had DeJon Stribling. Um, this is another guy. I don't know if he's going to get to 82. He is a big-bodied receiver. Know some people at Ole Miss who speak really highly of this dude from a character standpoint. And he is willing to throw his hat in there as a blocker. Has probably a little more route running ability than he was able to show at Ole Miss because of their very like option route system, but he would align in the slot. He would move outside. I think a really good fit for the Vikings receiver depth and receiver room. 97, the center, Jake Slaughter. Jake is probably the bigger bodied guy of the bunch. Really smart player, really good processor, can kind of command things at the line of scrimmage. I guess my biggest question for center, and it's not something I have a definitive answer to, is are the Vikings going to want to target a center who is smaller and a little more mobile to play in some of the vertical outside zone type of system they want to run this upcoming season and into the future with Frank Smith having been hired as the assistant head coach, having worked with Mike McDaniel in Miami. But I definitely think center is going to be in play. And so, like, before I get to the final four picks, and we'll do that, like, I think it's like the idea of getting a potential starting right tackle at 28, a starting running back at 49, a starting nickel slash safety at 59, a number 2/3 big body receiver at 82, and then a starting center at 97. Like, again, are all these guys going to hit? Are all these guys guarantees? No, they never are in the draft, but like, to potentially come away, you just play the odds with 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5 really solid starters, high character, core guys who fit their systems. It's hard for me to, it would be hard for me to dismiss that. And then we'll get to the last four picks. So, defensive tackle at 163, Zane Durant. Guard at 196. I'm going to have a hard time pronouncing it, from Wake Forest. Faamo is his name. Defensive tackle at 234, Renee Conga from Louisville. And then safety at 235, Deshaun Singleton. So I'm not really well voiced in all these players. Zane Durant at 163, I know, is a really athletic, explosive interior defender who is kind of a lighter body. Never was spectacular, I would say, at Penn State from a production standpoint. And that is, you'll probably hear me say this and write this a lot over the next week or so, but like, I do think college production was huge for the first five guys we mentioned. I think it's going to be huge for the picks that the Vikings make, because that is a very predictive measure. And the Vikings, like, you could kind of dumb it down and say they want to just hit the ball in the fairway. But I think, like, hitting the ball in the fairway, I would view the draft as a course with the smallest fairway possible. Like, it is impressive to be able to hit the ball in the fairway and come away with legitimate starters. So I just think the production thing is an important point to mention. And then if you're not going to get a defensive tackle with the first five picks, finding a way to do that would be important. I think, like, similarly, if you took a defensive tackle up top, finding a potential depth tackle late would be kind of, would be important. And then I mentioned the late round safeties. I think like tight end would be another position that you look at. And then there's no off ball linebacker here. And like that's another position where if Blake Cashman, does not come away with an extension this offseason, what is the future at that spot with Eric Wilson and Blake Cashman? Like I think that's a spot where you could use some depth, you could use some youth, and wouldn't even surprise me if that happened on day 2. So I like this mock draft really mostly because I like the idea of the trade back and you get another pick in that sweet spot range. So appreciate Suits Bear for sending that along. I'll be curious what you guys think of that specific mock draft and the trade back in general, because again, it's going to be hard for me to be talked out of it, I would say. All right, that should do it for the early week episode of the Alec Lewis Show. Thank you guys for being here. As always, it's the nitty-gritty draft time of year. We're going to have a guest for you coming back on Thursday, and then next week we'll be locked and loaded with all draft content all the time. Comprehensive coverage of The Athletic that I cannot wait to put together. And yeah, so that's this episode 157 of the Alec Lewis Show, presented by First Resource Bank. Please check out Pro MN Athletics and what they're doing for youth football in the Minnesota area. There's really good people are operating that thing, and I know that I want to help them get the word out, because I do think, part of how I can use the platform here is to just like help lift the tide for Minnesota football in general. And these guys, that's like their mission. So cool to get to do that. Unreal, locally owned clothing brand that has supported the show since the fall. And check out more stories at theathletic.com this week and next. And can't wait for the draft. Should be very, very fun. With that, that'll do it for episode 157. And we will talk to you guys very, very soon.